My name is Garrett Hennigan. I'm a community organizer at the Washington Area Bicyclist Association, as you all probably know. I recognize many of the faces here. And I'm really delighted to see so many of you for our seventh week of our summer advocate training series. We've been doing a number of these. We'll have the videos posted up soon, and we have actually a few more coming. Tonight, we're going to be talking all about sort of a brief primer on some of the considerations that we should be thinking about and planning around before we kick off a campaign. So thanks for joining. Let's go ahead and get started. There we go. So just a few logistics. Hopefully this is not your, or I would imagine that this is not your first video chat, but just so you know, this session is being recorded. Encourage you to find the controls for reactions, chat, mute. We'll be introducing ourselves in just a moment. As you all have already done, thank you. Please feel free to mute yourself when you're not talking, just to keep things good and easy to follow. I will be stopping from time to time for questions. We'll be going for about 45 minutes, maybe an hour, depending on the number of questions and sort of discussion. And if you have a comment, please feel free to throw it into the chat. Great. So before we get into the meat of things, trying to find, there we are. Before we get into the meat of things, I want you all to think about, tonight we're talking about campaigns, how we plan them, and specifically campaigns around making streets safer, more walkable, more bikeable, and slower for everyone to sort of navigate around. It will be helpful as we're talking through some of the elements of strategy for you to be thinking about a specific problem that you would like to solve in your community or perhaps on your commute. So before we get started with the nuts and bolts of things, I want you to write down 3 street or sidewalk problems that you would like to solve in your community. Now, when I say problems, note that we're not yet talking about possible solutions to them, but some of them that I think about is on the street right out front of my house. It's on a downward slope. It's a one-way street. People speed on this street all the time. That's a problem I would love to solve. Lots of solutions, but just talking about problems now. So just think of three of those problems that you see that you would like to solve. They can be big, they can be small, so long as they're specific. And I'll give you a chance to share some of those if you're eager in just a moment. And in fact, we haven't done introductions yet, so we are going to do that now. Let's go around real quick. And since there are just a few of us, we can do this pretty quickly. But introduce yourself. So what's your name? What neighborhood or community do you live in? And the third thing, if you feel like sharing them, maybe share your top street sidewalk problem that you would like to solve. And let's see, I can just go ahead and read down the list since I think we're all looking at things in a different order. So how about we start off at the bottom, reverse alphabetical, Zachary Weinstein. Want to go ahead and unmute yourself, introduce?
Hey, Garrett, long time no see.
Hi.
So my name is Zach Weinstein, and I volunteered with the WABA Montgomery County Action Committee. I live in Silver Spring, and I founded the recreational group Bike Silver Spring on Facebook. And let's see, I guess the biggest problem that's been frustrating me lately is on the street right outside of where I live. There are lots of obstructions in the walk, traffic signs and lamps and all sorts of things.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing. We're going to go to Olivia and then Mary Jane.
Hi, my name's Olivia. I live downtown near Logan Circle and just moved here a few years ago from Minneapolis. And I think the biggest thing that is bothering me right now is not specific to streets and sidewalks, so maybe this doesn't count, but just like why aren't there more dedicated bike paths that aren't multi-use or that are somehow like separated from pedestrians on the bike paths? Because Minneapolis has a lot of that and I miss it.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you. I think that's a very applicable thing to talk about tonight. Let's see. Oh my list switched around.
Okay, I think you said I was next. I'm
Yes, indeed. Please go
Mary
ahead.
Jane, and I live in Old Town Alexandria. I don't ride a bike. I'm a pedestrian. And the issue, I guess, that I would like to work on is we have a lot of new construction that's going on in various parts of Alexandria, and trying to work the issues before they become problems of exactly what Olivia was talking about, of making sure that we don't have a place where bicycle commuters and pedestrians heading to a metro are sharing the same narrow little sidewalk with a high-speed road directly to one side of them.
Great. So you have a lot of people using the same narrow space.
Mm-hmm.
That's
and nowhere to go to get out of the way of each other.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you for joining us. Let's see. Going to go with Benjamin and then Courtney, and if we could keep them just good and quick so we can get through.
Sure. I'm Benjamin Nichols. I live in Clarendon and Arlington, and I would say that my number one street priority is like there's a intersection near my house that you can get like one way in all bike lanes and you can't get the other way in all bike lanes, and I find it really frustrating. And it's like the only part of my like errand commute that I can't do in a bike lane. So.
Absolutely. Courtney?
Hi everyone. I'm Courtney Coffin. I live near U Street, and in my neighborhood, I think one of my biggest frustrations are intersections and crosswalks that are confusing and not pedestrian friendly, or not prioritizing pedestrians.
Great. Thanks for letting us. Let's see. Let's go with Jason and then Tina.
Sure. I'm Jason Klock. I live in Columbia Heights, not too far from the WABA office as it stands. And I think the big issue is I really want a connected bike network in DC. We don't have that now. And I guess specifically near me, there's the 15th Street cycle track that ends. Right? I'd love that to go somewhere. And then the 14th Street project is causing us issues right now with buses and everything else. So I'm just hoping for more protected infrastructure for sure.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah, 15th Street bike track was going to be my issue. So I second that, especially where it ends at Euclid. You sort of feel like you're in a really dangerous place when you end up there, and it's really hard to get to the right side of the street through the intersection. And then there's a few other places like that, I think, sort of where a bike lane or a bike track just sort of ends and leaves you in the middle of nowhere. The other, I mean, you and the WABA office are, I'm sure, aware of this, but the intersection of Columbia and 16th, and then of Harvard and Mount Pleasant Street, because I live in Columbia Heights, it's just, it's one of the most dangerous things I do on a regular basis, probably, is go through the intersection. And I think that, I'm sure I know it's very complex, but I'm sure there's better options than what they have now.
Sure. So your list of problems are essentially every street in my neighborhood connecting the network. I feel it. I feel you. Let's see. I think we've gotten Callie, and did we hear from Dan?
Hey, this is
right.
Dan. Oh,
Go ahead, Dan.
oh, sorry, Callie. I didn't mean to jump in front of you. My name is Dan Barron. I live in Riverdale Park in Prince George's County. It's probably not my biggest issue, but something I've noticed more during the pandemic is state administered roads that don't have pedestrian lights that activate without the call button, and sensors that don't pick up on people on bikes.
Great. I'm Callie. I live in Brooklyn. And I think my top 3 current issues are, the first is speeding on the road that I live on. I live on a street that doesn't have stop signs, so people seem to choose it to zoom down. I think another issue is just we have some really inaccessible sidewalks that are just impeded by light posts and other things that I think make it really hard to get around. And then I'm going to jump on that continuous bike lane train.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining. And I think, let's see, Ike? I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name.
Yeah, it's Ike, and I live in Woodley Park. And I guess my main bike issue would be just a lack of good options to get up and down Connecticut Avenue, like to Cleveland Park, especially on busy zoo weekends. It's just not feasible to bike on the road or bike on a sidewalk. So.
Absolutely. Great. Well, I appreciate you all. I think I got everyone. Did I miss anyone? Okay, great. Well, I appreciate you all thinking sort of about specific issues, specific problems that you'd like to solve. Because really what we're talking about now is defining some of those issues, defining them, finding a solution to some of those problems. Okay, so broadly speaking, almost most of the work that I do with WABA is working with volunteers like yourselves on campaigns, campaigns to fix a specific problem with a specific issue, or fix a specific problem with a specific solution. And that solution is more or less, just to define our terms, what we call issues. So a good campaign is built around an issue. An issue is a specific solution to a problem. So you all mentioned tons and tons of problems, speeding on particular blocks, obstructed sidewalks, difficult to cross streets, not enough space with too many people biking and walking all in the same space without good alternatives. Those are all problems. And our first task is to really figure out what are the solutions and which is the one that we are actually going to be working towards. I think in this case, it's good to think about small issues because it's a little easier to think through the strategy of how we might get those things fixed. But yeah, so the first step is really to pick your issue. As an example, back in 2013 in DC, this is a problem all across the region, but it was most acute in DC. We had this problem of constantly road work, people doing utility work, and major building construction work would be happening right on a street where we had, some bike lanes or protected bike lanes, trails, even sidewalks. And the problem was that construction work would just basically happen right in the middle of that bike lane. And they would just throw up a cone, like you see here on 15th Street, and they say, well, go around, go somewhere else. The bike lane's closed. And this was legal at the time. And so with that problem, we saw a lot of solutions. But the one that seemed most effective at the time, the best solution, and what became our issue for this campaign, was to focus on a legislative fix, to put a legislative fix in place. So the issue for that campaign was to pass legislation requiring that any construction that has to close a bike lane or a trail or a sidewalk must also provide what was called a safe accommodation for pedestrians and bicyclists. We can talk about the effectiveness of this law at another time, but this is sort of an example of how we can define an issue. So it's a specific solution to a problem. When we start a campaign, probably the most important step that we take is choosing which issue, choosing which solution to the problem. Many of you all identified, some very clear-cut problems. There aren't enough crosswalks, or the crosswalks are too dangerous. It seems like there may be a very simple and obvious solution to that problem. Well, let's just stripe more crosswalks, or let's put in stop signs. But really, every problem has a lot of potential solutions, and each of those, might be weighed differently. So we'd like to think about, there's a huge long list. We sort of work with a checklist of things to think through, ways to compare one solution to another. And here's just a few that are on the screen. To pull out a few, I think that one at the top is a really important one. Does this solution, does this issue bring a real improvement in people's lives? If you are successful, will people take a look at that and say, wow, this is so much better. This is going to change, change something meaningful. If not, maybe it's not a good issue. Maybe it's a big improvement for you, but it should also be widely felt. It should make a big change for more than just you. Ideally, it should be something that lots of people look to and say, that is important. That's something that I want to work on. I want to solve that problem with that solution. So widely felt is, I think, is an important one. Deeply felt too. We typically don't want to, with a campaign, we're probably going to be spending some time, some personal effort, possibly bringing other people into the fold. So we want to make sure that they're also deeply felt issues, not just something superficial that's less likely to really have an impact in people's lives. A few more to pick out. It should be, ideally, maybe not always, but ideally it should be non-divisive. It may take some time for people to understand the issue, for people to fully grasp what you're talking about, but ideally we shouldn't be picking, issues and running campaigns that we know from the outset are going to divide a community. Just as a matter of practicality, they're much harder, but also that's sort of running counter to many of the values that, for example, WABA has, but probably you also have for your community. So those are a lot of, I'd say, important ones. It should have a clear time frame. It should be winnable. So pick an issue that's actually possible to win, which also often means it has to be a very specific solution to a problem. Turning over to, those are general principles, I think, for any campaign. You can, compare a bunch of different issues, a bunch of different possible campaigns using this list. Most of the things that we're talking about that you all mentioned were related to, in some way, safe streets, street safety, bicyclist safety, pedestrian safety. So we have a couple of criteria that you see here that you may want to think about as well. First and foremost, this has to solve, that you should be looking to solve a street safety or access problem. In terms of who it's for, maybe your issue is about putting in bike lanes on a street. It should be, to be most worthwhile, it should be improving access or safety for all people who bike. And certainly we know that the people biking today is not everyone. That low stress biking facilities like trails and protected bike lanes in most contexts are much more attractive and appealing to people who on most roads would never consider riding a bike, but you make the street more suitable to their needs and they say, hey, yeah, I'd love to ride there. Also, since we're talking about street safety, we may be, the Washington Area Bicyclist Association, but we want to be looking at a big tent. So these things should be improving pedestrian safety as well. The best projects that we work on, the best campaigns that we run are about expanding the existing low stress network. Not a bike lane here disconnected, that really just helps you connect from one point to another point, but should add to the network. Last but certainly not least, because it's really, really critical, will this solution to a problem, will this issue actually meet the needs of the whole community? This gets back to it being divisive. do most people look at this problem and say, yes, that is a problem. It's a big problem for our community, and your solution is actually good for me. Which you can compare all these criteria together. But at the end of it, really, I think the most important question is, what is different when you've actually won, when you succeeded in getting this change made? And what kind of difference does that make for you and for other people in the community? So taking this list and looking at your problems, not your problems, but the problems that you wanted to solve, take a few moments and maybe jot down some potential, think through some potential solutions to those problems. And maybe weigh them against each other. Pick out some of these criteria. Try to whittle it down to one issue for a campaign, so that we can sort of work through that. I had a very quick aside. Over here on the left side, be easy to understand. Just as a note, like these are not all inclusive and they're not in any way weighted. Sometimes, I'd say most of the time, it's important that your campaign, that your issue is easy to understand. You should be able to explain it in about 15 seconds. And if you haven't, maybe your issue is just too complicated. But that's not always the case. A couple of years ago, WABA finished off, we won a campaign to overturn DC's contributory negligence doctrine, which is a very complicated concept that I won't even get into right now because it's very complicated. But in that case, it was something that very few people were aware of, is all about tort law, and was hard to explain and even harder to understand. But in the end, all the benefits of winning this were worth it, did make real improvements in people's lives, was winnable. It was absolutely worthwhile. And while many people probably don't know that victory even happened, if they're ever in a crash, they will benefit deeply from that win. So they're all relative. Any questions on that? I'm going to stop there for a moment. Any questions on this sort of checklist?
It occurred to me that a lot of the issues that we tackle, though, seem to be divisive. Maybe they, it always seems like they shouldn't be, but I don't know. It seems like every time we try to put a bike lane somewhere, there's, people that oppose it either because they're losing parking or sometimes they're not losing anything. They just, don't want cyclists in their neighborhood or whatever the argument is. So I think I agree with most of these, but I'm having trouble reconciling the non-divisive bullet.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So again, none of these are set in stone. None of them are disqualifiers, or most of them are not disqualifiers. I would say winnable would be a disqualifier if it weren't. But yeah, these are all really nuanced. And thanks for that question, because it's a great segue sort of into just a quick discussion. So we define our campaigns around an issue, a specific solution to a specific problem. And those issues should be winnable. But as I mentioned, we should be able to point to a marked change, a substantial change that comes about after we've won. But there are two sides to that, right? Potentially many sides to it. A good campaign succeeds by, in part, when one of the things there, one of the criteria was altering the relations of power. Now, real quick, what does that mean? There are two ways of doing that, I suppose. In one case, you bring together a number of people who relatively have little power, little authority, little ability to change to make change around the problem. And with some good strategy and some good organizing, they collectively build up some power amongst themselves and make a change that benefits all of them, that benefits potentially more than the people who are working on this, ideally. Another way to alter the relations of power is for a relatively small group of people to amass that power, to exclude other people, and to make a change that only benefits them. One of these is a good thing, and one of them is not. So it's always important to ask the question, who is winning here? Who is benefiting? And specifically, if there's a winner, is there a loser? So in the case of many of the protected bike lanes that we're talking about, you're working with a relatively narrow street. Many people use that street. Many people benefit from how the street is sort of designed today. If you're someone who parks on that street very regularly, very likely there's a lot of places to park. And if you're someone who bikes on that street or walks on that street and wants more space to do that, you could benefit by perhaps repurposing some of that parking space or a driving lane to bike lanes. The big question, though, is by making that change, who is benefiting and who is potentially not benefiting? We really want to be careful about sort of how a campaign relates to, say, justice. If somebody's losing a parking space, who is losing that parking space? Are they a typically privileged group? Or especially putting on sort of a racial justice or racial equity lens, are they a group that already had relatively little power? So, and in particularly for safe streets, if that's not the case, we should be looking for opportunities to reshape our issue, make it more inclusive, find a way to make everybody win. And not just in a way of like we're arguing that everybody wins, but actually changing our goals, changing our specific solution so that everybody wins. Winning should be inclusive. It is naturally set up to have a winner and a loser, but we should really challenge ourselves to make sure that everybody wins. And sometimes that takes more time. It takes more flexibility. Okay, I have harped on that enough, but it's a really important thing. Especially, every community is different, and the power dynamics of every community is different. The history and context are really critical. Does anybody have, at this point, an issue, a specific solution to a problem that they would like to share? It's okay if not.
I can share. So again, my issue is about bike paths, so maybe less relevant. But every time I bike on the Capitol Crescent Trail these days, obviously it's very crowded and dangerous feeling, especially with COVID. And I know there are some parts of the path that are probably not wide enough to just paint 3 lanes, but ideally there would be some paint that designates like one way for bikes going one way for bikes going the other way, and then 1 lane for pedestrians. But I think there are some parts of the trail that might be wide enough for that, and I would just love to throw some paint down. Or I don't know how hard it would be to actually just widen the trail by a few feet.
Okay, great. So what I like about your issue is it's specific. I'm taking it that your problem that you've identified is that the trail is very chaotic, and your issue would be to make the Capitol Crescent Trail safer by perhaps in some cases widening, but definitely giving people more specific guidance on lanes and things with some paint. I think this checks a lot of boxes, results in a real improvement to people's lives, fewer crashes potentially, fewer conflicts between people biking and walking on the trail. Would it be widely felt? The Capitol Crescent Trail is one of the busiest trails is the busiest trail in Montgomery County and one of the busiest in the region. So I think widely felt, yes. Would it be non-divisive? I think in that case, you always get some people who don't like a thing, but that'd probably be pretty non-divisive. It could have a clear time frame. And in this case, in terms of altering the relations of power, by heading off a successful campaign, perhaps you would get enough people together focusing on this issue that we would be in a good place to focus on another issue on the Capitol Crescent Trail in the future. So I think that's great. Thanks for sharing. I'm sure there are others who want to share them, but we're going to move on. So we're talking about strategy tonight, and we're now at about 7:07, so we'll keep on moving. As we see it, there are about five key elements of a good strategy for a campaign. Many of these things that we're going to be talking about come from sort of an organizing strategy from the Midwest Academy. They have a fantastic book here called Organizing for Social Change, which is a great read. They also do two week-long trainings. So we're really just skimming the surface here. But once we have our issue identified, there are a few things that we want to talk about, that we want to think through. First and foremost, and often we may deal with these in different order, but here's a helpful order to start with. So we have our goals, which is more or less the order of milestones that we need to clear. We have our what's often called organizational considerations, but really this is just a sense of your resources and context, what you bring to the table, and what that context means for how your campaign will work. Third, we want to think about who are the people who are immediately benefiting from our campaign. Who are those people who deeply and widely feel the importance of this issue? Who are the organizations that may be predisposed to ally with us to make it happen? And also, who are the people who oppose this, and why do they oppose it? Is it, what's their rationale? Is there a way that we could reframe our issue to bring those opponents on board? Again, getting back to that divisiveness. We'll talk about both a target and a decision maker. That's just the same name for the same person. Target is a little aggressive, but I think it's a good metaphor. This is the one person who can give us what we want. And we'll talk about power mapping in just a minute. And then finally, tactics. These are the things, the actions and events, the things that we'll do to recruit people, bring new allies on board, to convince our target to give us what we want, to give us success on our goals. So 5 key categories, and these are all borrowed from the Midwest Academy. So as I said, we're going to go a bit out of order. All of these criteria you should be thinking about for your own issue, just as a thought exercise. So all of this fits together into a big strategy chart. And this thing, don't worry about reading all of this. We'll be sort of referring back to it. And I will certainly send you a copy of it. But it's a helpful way of thinking through all the things that might come up for a campaign. Again, it's from the Midwest Academy. They're fantastic. And on the top line, you see all the things that we just discussed. So we are going to go a bit out of order. We're going to start with targets. Now, a target is the person, the one person who can give you what you want. Your issue informs your goals. Your target is the person who can actually give you success, who can give you a win. And their targets, so we're going to put a bullseye on there, forgive the metaphor. We may have multiple targets, but we will always have one primary target. That person is a single person. They have a name, they have a history, they have interests, they may have friends, hopefully they do. It's always important to name this person. It can be tempting to say, well, I want to get some protected bike lanes, so it's, I don't know, the Department of Transportation, they're our target. But in fact, that department has many people who work there, and there's one person who can, wake up one morning and decide, we really need a protected bike lane on this street, and they can make it happen. So in that case, it would be the director of that Department of Transportation, or perhaps, if they have a lot of authority, the project manager for a particular project. It's not just about that one person, though, because you and I, we might not actually have any authority over that person. We can send them emails, we can, talk to them in person every chance that we get. We can be very annoying to them, but we have no direct authority over the decisions that they make, over their priorities. They can effectively ignore us and dismiss us, which unfortunately happens a lot. So we want to think about power mapping. We want to look at that person and ask the question, who are the people that this person listens to? Who has influence over that primary target? If some of you may have been at a previous training where we sort of did a thought exercise of, an 8-year-old kid really wants to get a bike, and looking at all the different people in the family and people in that kid's life who maybe they would go to arm ring about getting a bike. In the case of government, there's a whole lot of there's many kinds of influence. Maybe political influence. Certainly there's a direct report element of, there are council members who have oversight over a particular person. There's all sorts of different pressure. The primary target has friends, they have social circles who they may listen to. They may respect and listen to a particular journalist. So there's a lot of different angles there, and it's worth sitting down and thinking about who are the people that this person listens to. And then finally, to even one step further, is sort of the public audience. You and I, we are a part of that public audience. Individually, we don't have much authority. We can send emails, we can be a bother, we can take up people's time, but individually we can be dismissed. These are the people in that chart who we'd want to consider, the people who directly benefit from an issue, perhaps the people who oppose it, and everyone in between, including those who don't care at all. Where that public audience comes into play is when we start bringing people together, when we organize them, when we give them a single voice, when they show up in mass, when they do a thing in mass, that's where they have authority, because these are the same people that elected, leaders. They're the same people who show up in protests. They're the same people who, if we're talking more about a corporation, have buying power and spending power, and perhaps political power. So that's power mapping in a nutshell. There's one person who can give us what we want, and they listen to and respond to a whole lot of people. So a campaign is all about organizing and bringing together people at various levels along this spectrum to encourage and demand that our primary target gives us what we want. Any questions on that?
I have a quick question, actually.
Please.
How does identifying a primary target work when you're talking about legislation, when you need a certain number of multiple people to vote in favor or against something?
I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I have a little note here that says that. Yes, you very well might have many people who you need to rally together. I would encourage you, it's very possible that you'll have many targets, each with a different strategy of their own. you know, they each have different histories. They respond to different people. A part of power mapping is sort of figuring out where everybody sits. You may, you know, if you're looking at a legislative body, you may realize, well, we have this many votes for, we have this many votes against. If we just flip this one person, then we win. So then that one person would be the person to focus on. But you're absolutely right that in reality, many times we're looking at many different people who we need to convince. So so in that case, you have, you know, perhaps a different strategy for every single person. Or you focus in on, you know, the people you really need to move.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Great. So we have our target. We have the one person who can give us what we're looking for. We want to put a stop sign at, you know, at that busy intersection, or we want to get bike lanes put on that road. We found the one person who can give us that. There may be some formal process that has to go through, but at the end of the day, they are the one who's actually saying yes or no. They're the one who can say, you know, the rules say this, but we have some discretion here, and we're going to go ahead and put that stop sign in, even though it doesn't meet the warrants, because that they have the authority to do that. So now the rest of this chart is all about figuring out the best way to bring people together to make that decision maker, that primary target, give us what we want. So next up, goals. We have one goal. We have one ultimate goal, which is our long-term goal. This is literally the objective of the campaign. Once we've reached our long-term goal, which it's good to write out, because that helps us, you know, get efficient at communicating about these things. But everything else is more or less a to-do list of milestones that we need to reach before we get there. Not so much a to-do list of events and tactics that we want to do, but think of these as milestones, hurdles that we have to clear. In the case of a piece of legislation, think of it this way. Our ultimate goal is to pass the legislation, but looking at the process there, first we need to get someone to introduce the legislation. We need to convince a legislator that this is important enough for them to write it and put their name on it. Then there are other procedural steps after that. It needs to, after getting introduced, it needs to, you know, get support in a committee. It needs to pass markup. It needs to, there are many steps. And it's important to write these out because it helps us keep focused, and it helps us plan in the future what those tactics are. So we have long-term, we have intermediate, we have short-term. And the short-term are really like, what do we have to do once we launch the campaign? What is the first thing to do? Goals, I think, are pretty straightforward. Just important to recognize that a goal is something that your target can give you. And again, you may have a different target for different goals. So in the legislative example, if we put enough pressure and orchestrate our campaign in an effective way, then that legislator will feel pressured to vote for this bill and pass it. These are things that are completely under that target's control. So those are goals. Then we talk about this busy category, constituents, allies, and opponents. The main thing to take away here is that your constituents, you need to have people who care deeply about this issue. This is a good chance to make, a good check to make sure it's not just you. If it's a street safety issue in your neighborhood, you should talk to your neighbors. Those are the people who will probably directly benefit. Those are what we're going to call constituents. You should want to have you should aim to have a lot of constituents. If there aren't many people who directly benefit from a win, then perhaps you've defined things too narrowly. So look to expand it. You know, if it's a bike lane, you could look to how could we make this project, this solution, more inclusive of people who walk on this street. Allies are groups of people, so like organizations potentially, or businesses that may not directly benefit from success, but are affiliated. They want to support the cause, and there are a number of reasons why they might. But they themselves may not directly benefit, so it's not self-serving. It's not in their, not directly in their self-interest. And then I think opponents are pretty clear. It's good to spell out why people oppose a particular project. Why they oppose a particular campaign. Try to understand that. There's a lot of homework that goes into this, and spelling it all out can help you build a stronger strategy. And again, you don't have to get everything, but it's good to think through who are the specific people and groups. Try to put down names, especially for organizations. If you can't do that, think about broad types of people in the different circumstances. How might seniors in the neighborhood respond to this? How might people who shop at a particular store respond to this? Would they fall into the constituent, i.e. directly benefiting from a win or opponent category? So I think that's pretty self-explanatory. The final thing is, well, not the final, but that once you have those nailed down, we want to think about tactics. Oh, and actually, sorry. One more critical thing about a constituent is these people should have a direct relationship to the target. The reason that we care about them, the reason that we're thinking closely about who they are and where to find them is because if we bring enough of them together, they are the people who give us the power, the authority, the pressure to convince our decision maker, our target, to give us our goals. So in the case of a legislator, the constituents we should be going after first and foremost are the people who can actually elect that person. If they live 2 states over, they may feel deeply about the issue, but their voice doesn't necessarily give us any additional sway over that decision maker. So in our power mapping, it's good to look at, who that person is, what they care about, and also like what are the public audiences that have sway over them. For the allied groups, is this ideally go after groups that have some additional sway over that target as well. They may represent many people who can have some voting authority over them or other authority. I hope that makes sense. So once we figure all of that out, then we're on to tactics. And often people will jump immediately to tactics. And for some campaigns, that's fine. But we should think about all the things we just talked about first, because a tactic is an event or an action that directly puts a group of people in front of the primary decision maker, or perhaps a secondary decision maker, and puts pressure on them to make a decision. Real quick, we talked about effective tactics in a previous training, but an effective tactic should be focused on the decision maker. If you're just holding a rally, you bring a lot of people together, you talk about the issue, but you don't ever do anything that puts that group of people and their demand in front of a decision maker, that is perhaps a less effective tactic. It should have a specific demand. So if you're talking about, we want to put a protected bike lane on this street, you need to make sure that you make, that tactic, whether it's an event or an op-ed or a petition or a letter writing campaign, you need to make sure that it's putting that specific demand in front of the decision maker. And of course, it should advance your goals. Everybody loves a bake sale, but if your goal is not to raise funds and enjoy tasty treats, maybe it's not the most effective tactic. And broadly, I would put them into two categories. An effective tactic is either going to demonstrate your group's power to the decision maker. For instance, bring together a group of, you know, in the case of a petition, maybe, here's 1,000 people who are in your district who care deeply about this issue. So demonstrating your group's power to that decision maker. Or it should educate and grow your base. So explain your issues, get people on board, and also connect them to your campaign, generally speaking. And of course, you know, an effective tactic will always be specific to the issue, as we've talked about. And with that, with that broader chart, all of these things are sort of trying to be interwoven so that you're using your time most effectively. That is an overview. There's a lot of gaps there, I would assume, but I think a really helpful exercise for you as you're thinking about your particular problem that you mentioned. Come up with an issue, come up with a specific solution to it, put it through that checklist that we talked about, and I'll share by email some of those resources so you can do this on your own. And try to just sketch out, you know, what does the strategy chart look like? Who are our targets? What is the sequence of milestones and goals that we should be working on? Who are the people who are naturally going to benefit from this? What are the groups of already organized people should we be going after? And finally, what are the events and actions that we're going to do that bring people together, show some power to that target, and educate people about our issue. And with that, I would love to hear any questions that you all have. If you want to talk through a particular, you know, campaign idea that you have, I'd say let's have it. And before we do that, I just want to quickly note that we have 2 more trainings coming up. These are both actually reschedules from previous weeks. These will likely be again on a Wednesday, but I may take a 1-week break. So I'll be announcing those very soon. And you can find out all about them at waba.org/fun when they're announced. But I'll also be emailing about them. So yeah.